What if everything you knew about the Second World War was missing a crucial front? History books are filled with the stories of D-Day, Stalingrad, and Midway, but they are silent about the war fought in the shadows, a war without tanks, without medals, and without glory. This is the story of a secret army, an army of railway workers who derailed trains with nothing but a wrench and perfect timing, of market women who waged espionage with folk songs, of clerks and farmers who became saboteurs and spies. They fought for the Allies, but they were fighting for something else, something the Empire never expected them to claim. This is the untold story of how the battle for freedom from colonialism began in the secret heart of World War II. This is Hidden Frontlines.
Act 1. The Empire's Arteries. They had no tanks, no air squadrons, no medals waiting for them at the end of the war. What they had were machetes, courage, and the will to fight from the shadows. From the forests of Kenya to the railway yards of Nigeria and the port towns of Ghana, ordinary Africans waged an invisible war. They were farmers turned to saboteurs, clerks turned spies, railwaymen who derailed trains with nothing but a wrench and timing born of desperation. As Allied convoys sailed the Atlantic and desert battles raged in North Africa, deep inside Britain's colonies, another front was burning. One fought with stolen telegraphs, loosened bolts, and whispered codes written on scraps of newspaper. History called it support work. They called it resistance. They fought for the Allies, yes, but beneath that, they fought for something greater. The right to be heard in a world that never listened. Because you don't need a rifle to change history. Sometimes, all you need is the courage to pull the brake. Pause, allowing the weight of the last line to settle. When war broke out in 1939, the news didn't arrive in Africa by radio for most people. It arrived on a piece of paper, nailed to a tree in the village square by a colonial officer. It arrived in the form of a new quota, a longer workday, a conscription notice. For millions, the war was not a distant event in Europe. It was a sudden, heavy weight on their shoulders. Africa was the factory, the granary, the mine for an empire at war. Think of the British Empire not as a lion, but as a body. And its veins? They ran not through the heart of London, but through the ports of Lagos, the rail hubs of Nairobi, the docks of Accra, Mombasa, and Port Harcourt. Copper from northern Rhodesia that would become shell casings. Tin from Nigeria for soldiers' ration tins. Rubber from Ghana for truck tires. It was all sucked from the land and sent north. And the human cost? It was immense and it was personal. Take a young man named Joshua from a village in Nigeria. One day he was helping his father tend their yam farm. The next he was in the carrier corps, carrying 60-pound loads of artillery shells through the sweltering heat, not for a day, but for years. His body was a tool of the empire, just like the pickaxe and the railway track. The colonial authorities promised pay, but it was a pittance. They promised glory, but it was a foreign concept. What people felt was the bite of the whip, the gnawing hunger from rations diverted to European troops, and the bitter irony of building the very system that oppressed them. A dock worker in Takoradi would spend his day loading crates marked Lend-Lease onto ships, then go home to a hut with a leaking roof and a hungry family. The disconnect was a quiet, burning fuse. The railway was the empire's bloodstream, and the workers its pulse. They saw the generals and the district officers come and go, but they were the constant. They knew every squeak of a wheel, every soft spot on the track, every temperamental engine. They realized something profound, a simple, powerful truth. Without their labor, without their compliance, the great machine stopped. No train rolled, no convoy departed, no empire functioned. That realization, that quiet collective understanding, was the first and most powerful act of resistance.
Act 2. Whispers on the Rails. They were not soldiers. They were engineers, signalmen, blacksmiths, and clerks. But they understood the machine that fed the war better than the generals who commanded it. They saw its weaknesses not as abstract strategic points, but as physical realities. The railway lines were masterpieces of precision and vulnerability. A single loosened bolt could, over miles of track, shake a coupling apart. A handful of sand in a journal box could overheat an axle and cause a hot box, forcing an entire train to a grinding, hours-long halt. A misplaced signal could send a munitions train onto a siding while a passenger train took priority. It was a symphony of movement, and they were the conductors who could, with a subtle gesture, introduce a note of chaos. In Kenya's Athi Plains, the mechanics began meeting after dark, not in secret caves, but in the most obvious place, the rail yard itself, beneath the carcass of a freight car that was always waiting for parts. They passed around a single kerosene lamp, its flame casting long shadows on the steel underbelly of the empire. One man would keep watch, not for soldiers, but for the night foreman, a man known for his unpredictable rounds. It was here that a man named Mwangi Wakaranja, a blacksmith with forearms like iron cables, would share his theories. His theories were less about metallurgy and more about creative disassembly. The British taught us to fix their engines, he would later recall, a sly smile in his voice. We became creative students. We learned how to make them rest. It started with plausible deniability. Grease was carefully mixed with fine, abrasive sand. Brakes were accidentally misaligned during routine adjustments, so they would bind and smoke after a few miles. A heavy wrench would slip from a greasy hand and find its way deep into the gears of a turntable. Accidents happen, you know. But soon the sabotage grew systematic, almost artistic. In Nigeria, on the vital Lagos-Kano line, a British engineer named Fitzpatrick was driven to despair by the constant breakdowns. He'd write in his reports about the infernal climate and native incompetence. He never once looked at his most diligent worker, a man named Ibrahim, who could take apart a steam engine blindfolded, and considered that Ibrahim might also be a genius of delay. It was like watching someone slowly, lovingly take apart a watch while it was still ticking. And the British never heard a thing over the noise of their own assumptions. And the communication was as ingenious as the sabotage. The rail yards were a hive of information. Messengers carried coded notes, not hidden in hollow coins, but in plain sight, written on scraps of brown wrapping paper from the goods shed, or tucked inside a half-empty tin of cigarettes. When a line was compromised, word spread through a language of innocuous phrases. "The engine has lost its whistle," one porter might hum to another while unloading sacks of mail, meaning a train had been successfully delayed. "The mountain sleeps," his companion would reply, wiping sweat from his brow, meaning the plan was complete and the coast was clear. The resistance learned to live between the ticks of the clock, invisible, patient, precise. Every delay cost the empire money, time, and most importantly, confidence. Every malfunction whispered the same unmistakable truth. Africa was no longer silent, and its voice was the sound of grinding metal. Act 3. The Night Messengers.
Every resistance has its soldiers, but in Africa, many of them never wore uniforms or held a weapon. They wore the uniforms of daily life, aprons stained with market goods, headscarves bright against the sun, and bare feet dusted with the red soil of their homeland. The war's official lifelines, the telegraph wires, the heavily guarded ports, the armored railroads, were watched by soldiers with sharp eyes and loaded rifles. But the empire's true weakness lay in what it could not see, what it dismissed as backward. The footpaths through the dense bush, the slow-flowing rivers, the bustling, chaotic markets, and the ancient, rhythmic songs. In the Gold Coast, the cocoa markets were not just places of commerce, they were living, breathing switchboards of intelligence. The women traders, sitting behind their baskets of beans, were the operators. They hummed simple melodies as they worked, tunes passed down for generations. But now, one particular rhythm, a syncopated tap-tap-tap on a calabash, meant patrols on the main road. Another, a specific call and response used for haggling, marked the arrival of a new, secret shipment of Allied aircraft parts in Takoradi Harbor. To the untrained eye of a British officer, it was just native noise, a lullaby of commerce. To the resistance, it was a crystal-clear alarm. In Kenya, the vast open landscapes of the Rift Valley became a porous, unstoppable postal service. Farmers, the original masters of logistics, wrapped messages in waterproof banana leaves. These were not handed off in back alleys, but tied under the oxen yokes of a plowman heading to town, or tucked inside a basket of maize being taken to the weekly market in Nakuru. Each note carried codes written not in numbers but in the poetry of Swahili proverbs, understood by all but the outsiders. The lion drinks early, meaning soldiers are moving and you should take cover. The river bends twice, a signal that a delay operation had been successful. And in Nigeria's intricate network of riverine villages, the fishermen, who knew the creeks and mangroves like the lines on their own hands, were recruited. They became the ones who paddled between shadows. Small, waterproof bamboo tubes, sealed with wax, were secured beneath their canoes. Inside were intelligence reports, hand-drawn maps of British depot layouts, and sometimes even developed photographs smuggled out by cleaners working inside headquarters. Many of the most effective messengers were women, like Ama Tete, the Ghanaian trader. She smuggled messages between Accra and Takoradi not by hiding in secret compartments, but by walking straight through checkpoints. She sewed thin, tightly rolled scrolls of paper into the thick, layered hem of her traditional dress. When questioned by board guards, she would laugh, a full-throated, genuine sound, and shoo them away with a wave of her hand. Only women's gossip. And in a way, she was telling the truth. It was the kind of gossip that carries the seeds of revolution, the kind of talk that topples empires. These messengers did not speak of freedom in grand speeches from balconies. They practiced it in motion, with every step, every paddle stroke, every hummed tune, carrying truth disguised as routine. And so, under the moonlight, while the empire's trains rolled and its armies marched, a second, deeper network pulsed quietly beneath it all. Human, invisible, unstoppable. It was the first whisper of Africa's own awakening, and it was carried not on the shoulders of generals, but on the hands of grandmothers, traders, and fishermen.
Act 4. Sabotage in the Shadows. By 1942, the quiet resentment had boiled over. Africa's hidden war was no longer just about delays and minor inconveniences. The whispers in the rail yards had matured into concrete, audacious plans. And now, those plans began to burn. The catalyst was often something small, a final straw. In Kenya, it was the public flogging of a young porter who had been caught stealing a single can of corned beef for his starving family. The injustice was a spark in a room full of gasoline.
That very night, in the Nairobi yards, the mechanics held a meeting not under the freight car, but boldly inside a maintenance shed. The plan was no longer to slow the empire, but to make it bleed money and time. The target was a dedicated fuel convoy, a string of tanker cars bound for the North African front, where Rommel's Afghan Corps was desperately thirsty for petrol. The saboteurs, led by the methodical Mwangi, didn't need explosives. They had knowledge. They knew a specific remote curve outside Athi River, where the track was already slightly stressed. Over 2 nights, they worked with the precision of surgeons. Critical bolts were not removed, but loosened just enough that the stress of the heavy train would do the rest. Sand and fine metal shavings were introduced into the lubrication points of the tanker's axles. On the night of June 14th, the convoy, pulled by a straining locomotive, hit the curve. The weakened rails shifted. The overheated axles on the third tanker seized. The result was not a dramatic Hollywood explosion, but something more insidious, a slow, grinding, brutal derailment. Tankers jackknifed, tearing open like tin cans, pouring thousands of gallons of precious fuel into the red dirt. The British report, written in a stuffy office in Nairobi, would later call it a catastrophic structural failure due to metal fatigue and poor maintenance. But the truth traveled faster than any official memo. The next morning, a boy named Samuel, selling sweet tea and roasted maize to railway workers, saw the British officers scratching their heads at the wreckage. He didn't say a word, but he caught the eye of a signalman, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Samuel smiled, turned to his friend, and whispered the coded phrase, "The lion stumbles." By sundown, that phrase was being whispered in the markets of Mombasa, hummed by farmers in the Rift Valley, and understood by dock workers in Dar es Salaam. It was a message of victory. In Nigeria, the sabotage became a sophisticated game of cat and mouse. The clerk, Ibrahim, and his network didn't just derail trains. They made the entire Lagos-Kano line, the empire's longest artery, seem cursed. They mastered the art of the disappearing shipment. A train would leave Lagos with 50 crates of .303 ammunition for the Desert War. It would arrive in Kano with 48. The paperwork would show 50. 2 crates had simply vanished into the bush, redirected to local communities who might one day use them. The British would blame poor record-keeping and pilfering, never imagining a highly organized redistribution system operating right under their noses. And in Ghana's port city of Takoradi, where Allied aircraft were assembled and flown directly to the front lines, the accidents became more brazen. A craftsman fitting a propeller would, with a precisely calibrated tap of his hammer, create a hairline crack that would only reveal itself under the stress of flight, forcing an emergency landing. Crates containing delicate aircraft instruments were accidentally dropped from a height just sufficient to render their contents useless. The British saw a pattern of incompetence. The workers saw a pattern of beautiful, coordinated defiance. It was a war of attrition, fought not with bullets, but with wrenches, misplaced manifests, and a profound understanding of the enemy's logistics.
Act 5. Signals and Spies. As the physical sabotage spread, information became its lifeblood. The resistance needed to know what to hit, when, and how to avoid the increasingly suspicious colonial authorities. This gave rise to a shadow war within a shadow war, the Battle of Intelligence. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, famous for its exploits in Europe, soon realized that to fight this unseen war, they needed eyes and ears that could blend in. They began to quietly recruit from the very pool of people they distrusted: African railway clerks, postmen, telegraph operators, and even school teachers fluent in Morse code. It was a marriage of convenience, and one built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The British thought they were recruiting loyal servants. In reality, they were often arming the resistance with their own secrets. In Accra,
A British agent known only as Mr. Thompson, a man who sweated profusely in his wool suit and never learned a word of Twi, established a network called the Gold Coast Line. Its mission was to track Axis spies and sympathizers moving between Vichy-controlled Dakar and Spanish Guinea. But the network was entirely run by Ghanaians like Kofi, a soft-spoken postal clerk. Kofi and his team didn't just follow orders, they filtered them. They would memorize the faces of German agents, but they would also memorize the routines and vulnerabilities of the British security patrols. Information far more valuable to the resistance. They passed messages not in locked briefcases, but hidden inside hollowed-out yams or woven into the patterns of traditional kente cloth. The real intelligence masters, however, were the telegraph operators. In Nigeria, men like Suleiman Bello, a man with an ear for music and the rhythm of Morse code, became masters of a deadly duet. Stationed in Kano, he would intercept encrypted access radio signals from Vichy-controlled territories. Using skills the British had taught him, he would decode them, then, with the speed of a concert pianist, re-encrypt and send back beautifully crafted false replies. He once sent a U-boat in the Gulf of Guinea on a 300-mile wild goose chase after a fictional Allied convoy, all while his British supervisor complimented him on his excellent throughput. Suleiman saved hundreds of lives that day, and his name appears in no history book. The official report would simply read, "Enemy submarine misdirected due to intercepted signal anomaly." In Kenya, the intelligence network was even more visceral. Postal workers, who handled all military mail, ran a secret microfilm operation. A driver named Kamau, who chauffeured a British major, used a tiny camera smuggled to him by an Indian merchant to photograph documents left casually on the back seat. The film was slipped inside a hollowed-out pencil and passed to a postal worker who would hide it inside an envelope marked Family News, going to a non-existent address in Cairo, a dead drop for an SOE agent. The images of airfield layouts and troop movements that landed on Churchill's desk often began their journey on the dusty floorboards of a staff car in Nairobi. The irony was thick enough to cut with a machete. The British were utterly dependent on the very people they were systematically oppressing to win their intelligence war. A Ghanaian interpreter, who spent his days listening to the British mock African simplicity, later reflected with cold fury, "We gave them the words to win their war, praying they would one day hear the words for ours."
Act 6. The Price of Defiance. Empires, when challenged, do not respond with reason. They respond with force. By 1943, the colonial authorities could no longer ignore the pattern. The accidents were too frequent, the intelligence leaks too damaging. The empire's own foundation was shaking, and it decided to use a sledgehammer to stop it. The crackdown was swift, brutal, and designed to terrorize. The British renamed the problem, calling it industrial unrest to downplay its political nature, but their actions were those of a regime facing an insurgency. Suspected workers were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Union leaders vanished into remote prison camps. The women, who had been the backbone of the communication network, were now particularly targeted. Amatete, the market trader, was finally caught. A new sharp-eared British sergeant, who had spent time in the Gold Coast before the war, recognized the subtle cadence of her gossip song as a warning signal. She was arrested, imprisoned, and publicly flogged. But they couldn't break her. When pressured to give up the names of her comrades, she refused. Her final words, as recorded by a horrified missionary who witnessed her punishment, were not of plea or defiance, but of profound dignity. "I only sing for those who listen." The executions were meant to be a final, terrifying lesson. In Mombasa, 15 mechanics from the rail yard were rounded up after a particularly damaging fire in a goods shed. There was no trial, no evidence, just a drumhead court-martial and a proclamation of guilt.
When the British officer asked if the men had any last words, one of the eldest, a man named Jomo who had fixed engines for 30 years, stepped forward. He looked the officer directly in the eye and said, with the calm certainty of a craftsman, "We built your rails. We can break them." He was executed at dawn, a message to all who watched. But the empire miscalculated. It thought it was sowing fear, but it was sowing martyrs. Each death was not an end, but a beginning. The story of Jomo's defiance was told and retold by lantern light, his words becoming a rallying cry. The story of Amatete's song became a legend, inspiring new, more complex codes. In Nigeria, railwaymen began a silent, powerful ritual. They would carve small, rough wooden crosses on their toolboxes, which they then painted red using stolen engine grease. It was not a Christian symbol, but a marker of remembrance, a promise that the fallen would not be forgotten. And in Kenya, a powerful rumor began to circulate, born in the rich oral tradition of the people. It was said that the spirits of those executed for sabotage would return, not as ghosts to be feared, but as guardians. They would ride the trains they once derailed, their spectral hands ensuring that the empire's machinery would never know peace. The story spread so effectively that superstitious British guards, many of them from rural backgrounds themselves, became reluctant to patrol the rail yards alone at night, hearing whispers in the wind and seeing shadows in the steam. By the end of 1943, the empire had restored a surface-level calm through sheer terror. But it was a fragile peace, a lid clamped down on a boiling pot. The cost of this temporary order was the last vestiges of loyalty. Fear had replaced cooperation. And in the silence that followed the crackdown, something new and unbreakable was taking root. A sense of shared sacrifice and a unified purpose. The resistance had been bloodied, but it was far from broken. In fact, it was just beginning to understand its own strength.
Act 7. Unity in the Fire. Oppression, for all its cruelty, is a strange and powerful teacher. It punishes the few, but it instructs the many. By 1944, the prisons of Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana were overflowing with political detainees. Yet, in a powerful paradox, so were the hearts of those still walking free. The crackdown had failed to shatter the movement. Instead, it had compressed it, forging a sharper, harder, and more unified weapon. The resistance evolved from isolated cells into a nascent, continent-conscious network. The shared experience of brutality became a common language. In the workshop yards of Nairobi, workers no longer gathered just to plan the next sabotage. They met to share news, often smuggled in by sympathetic guards or wives pretending to deliver food. They learned of strikes in Lagos, of dock workers in Takoradi refusing to load ships until their arrested comrades were freed, of farmers in the Gold Coast withholding their cocoa crops. A new phrase entered their whispers, a Kiswahili proverb that became their mantra. The train that burns in Kenya lights the path for brothers in Ghana. It was no longer just about their local struggle. It was about a continental awakening. This unity was powered by a profound shift in strategy. The railway unions, once tools for the empire to organize and control labor, were now hijacked from within. They became the central nervous system of the resistance. Mechanics, who once forged pistons for locomotives, now use the same forges to create metal plates for printing underground leaflets. Porters, masters of logistics and schedules, use their intricate knowledge of train timetables not to move cargo, but to coordinate protests across vast distances, ensuring demonstrations would happen simultaneously in different towns, confusing and overwhelming the colonial police. And the women, the amatetes of the movement, stepped out of the shadows and into leadership roles. The same women who had carried coded messages in their head ties now carried banners painted on old flour sacks. Their demands, shouted in the streets of Accra and Lagos, were deceptively simple. Equal pay for equal work.
But this was a Trojan horse. It was not merely an economic demand. It was a philosophical grenade thrown at the very heart of colonialism. It was a demand for recognition, for humanity, for the simple, radical idea that an African life was worth as much as a European one. A Nigerian dock worker, a man who had once secretly scuttled crates of ammunition, remembered the moment the shift occurred. He said, "They told us we were just laborers, cogs in their machine. But in trying to break us, they taught us we were a nation." This spirit of solidarity became tangible. In Accra, market women who had profited from the wartime economy now pooled their money into a secret fund to support the families of jailed railway workers. In Kenya, unionized mechanics, risking their own jobs, taught students and farmers the principles of nonviolent protest and organized labor. In Nigeria, a strike by railway workers was backed by a simultaneous boycott by market traders, paralyzing entire cities. The British could no longer dismiss this as mere unrest. This was a coordinated political beast they had never seen before. Their empire was learning to breathe on its own, and every breath was a word the colonizers feared. Uhuru, freedom. The same fires that once melted steel in the imperial forges were now melting the fear that had held an entire continent in chains.
Act 8. Echoes of Empire. 1945. The war in Europe was over. In London, there was euphoria. Fireworks lit up the sky over the Thames, and crowds cheered themselves hoarse. But in Africa, the fireworks looked eerily familiar. They were the sparks from grinders in the rail yards, the same backbreaking work resumed under the same old fluttering Union Jacks. The empire congratulated itself on victory and distributed its medals. Thin, tinkling circles of metal stamped with the king's profile. They were given to African soldiers who had carried rifles through the bloody hell of the Burmese jungle, to the men of the African Pioneer Corps who had hauled supplies across the Sahara. But the medals couldn't feed families. They couldn't silence the memory of promises made and broken. The homecoming was a lesson in bitter disillusionment. In Nairobi, veterans like Mwangi returned from the war, having seen the world and the fragility of the white man, to find their ancestral lands had been seized and given to white settlers as a reward for their wartime service. In Lagos, demobilized soldiers who had guarded strategic installations found themselves begging for work beside the very ships they once protected. In Ghana, the skilled mechanics who had kept the Takoradi air route operational, the lifeline to Cairo, were told there were no European-grade engineering positions available for them. The message was clear: you were good enough to die for the empire, but not good enough to lead in it. The war had been a brutal university. It had shown a generation of Africans that they could organize, lead, invent, endure, and outthink their colonizers. Now they asked the question their rulers had dreaded for decades. If we can fight and win your wars, why can we not fight and win our own? The answer came not in words but in action. In 1946, the strikes erupted again, but this time they were bigger, louder, and politically savvy. Railwaymen in Nigeria downed tools for 12 days, bringing the colony's economy to a standstill. Dock workers in Takoradi, using the blockade techniques they'd perfected during the war, refused to unload British ships. Ghanaian clerks in government offices, the invisible administrators of the colony, began a go-slow, deliberately misplacing tax records and losing important correspondence. The British administration, panicked, offered small reforms, a slight pay raise here, a toothless advisory council there, vague promises of partnership in a distant future. But Africa had glimpsed its own power, and the taste was addictive. It could not be untasted. And from the smoke of this discontent, new names began to rise. Men who would channel this raw energy into political lightning. Kwame Nkrumah, who had studied in America and London, was now in Accra, preaching self-governments now to enraptured crowds. Jomo Kenyatta, once a teacher and now a fiery political organizer, was rallying the farmers of the Kenyan highlands. And Nnamdi Azikiwe,
A fierce journalist from Onitsha was turning his newspaper into a weapon, his editorials dissecting colonialism with surgical precision. A frustrated British officer wrote in a confidential 1947 memo, "We built their roads and now they march upon them." He was more right than he knew. The empire's rails still shone under the African sun, but now they carried a new, dangerous cargo. Not goods for the empire, but ideas for its destruction. Freedom was in motion, and it was picking up speed.
Act 9. The Seeds of Freedom. The men who had once loosened bolts beneath a blanket of stars now stood before microphones, their voices amplified across public squares. The women who had sung coded songs into the wind now led political rallies of thousands, their voices clear and unafraid. The same courage that had derailed imperial supply trains was now derailing the empire itself. The transition from resistance to revolution was not a sudden explosion, but a deliberate, unstoppable harvest. The seeds planted in the wartime shadows were now bursting into the sunlight. The organizational blueprints, the communication networks, the trust forged in prison yards, all were repurposed for the final push for independence. In Kenya, the Railway Workers' Union, once the heart of sabotage, became the logistical backbone of the growing political movement. The men who knew how to move goods and people undetected now used those skills to move organizers, weapons, and intelligence for the Mau Mau uprising. The same hands that had once spilled engine oil to cause a malfunction now printed pamphlets calling for land and freedom. In Nigeria, the unions transformed almost overnight into potent political parties. The National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons drew its strength and its grassroots organization directly from the networks of railwaymen and dockworkers who had learned the power of collective action during the war. And in Ghana, the story reached its climax. The dockworkers and market women who had financed and sustained the wartime resistance now turned their power directly against the colonial state. They financed the strikes that paralyzed the ports, the lifeblood of the colony. In 1948, when Ghanaian veterans marched on Accra to demand their unpaid war benefits and were shot down by police, it was the market women who led the subsequent riots and boycotts that brought the colony to a total standstill. The colonial governor cabled London in despair, sending a message that would echo through the corridors of power. If we lose the docks, we lose the coast, and the coast is the empire. He was right. The empire was lost. The pressure became unbearable, and on a radiant day in 1957, the Union Jack was lowered over Accra for the last time. Ghana was free. And as Kwame Nkrumah stood before the jubilant crowd, declaring, "At long last the battle has ended," he was not standing alone. In that vast sea of faces were men with oil-stained overalls and women with calloused hands, the same hands that had once carried the empire's freight and then learned to carry its coffin. Freedom had not arrived solely from speeches or diplomatic treaties. It had been hammered into being over decades by the anonymous soldiers of the supply lines, the invisible architects of delay. Even the old trains seemed to celebrate. The engines that once hauled munitions for a foreign war now carried school children to newly built schools. The bridges once guarded by British bayonets now echoed with the laughter of a free people. The rails sang a new song, not of empire, but of endurance. And the song was just beginning.
Act 10. Echoes of the Rails. The empire is gone now. Its banners are folded away in museums.
Its proclamations faded to whispers in old archives, but its rails remain. Lines of steel threading through red earth and lush green, carrying stories that no textbook could ever contain. Sometimes, at dusk, an old engineer on the Nairobi-Mombasa line will swear he hears footsteps pacing the roof of his train, a swift, ghostly rhythm just above his cabin. His smile to himself. He knows it's not a ghost of fear, but a spirit of vigilance, the echoes of those who once rode the night to loosen bolts for freedom. Sometimes, in a market in Accra, an old woman will hum a lullaby to her grandchild, a melody her own grandmother once used to warn of approaching soldiers. The child will ask, "Grandmother, why does that song sound so sad and so strong at the same time?" And she will simply smile, her eyes holding a century of memory, and say, "Because it carries old, important truths." That is history whispering through the rails. These men and women were never decorated. You will find no bronze statues of Mwangi the blacksmith in Nairobi, or Suleiman the telegraph operator in Kano, or Amatete in the markets of Accra. Their names are not etched in stone on war memorials. Their medals were the calluses on their hands, the respect in their communities, the freedom their children would inherit. But their fingerprints are everywhere. They are on the very iron of the bridges that still stand. They are in the political DNA of the nations they helped midwife into being. They are in the unapologetic spirit of a continent that now speaks with its own voice on the world stage. Because history is not only written in the ink of treaties and victory dispatches, sometimes it is forged in the iron of a railway track. It is coded in a hummed tune. It is sealed with the quiet courage of a person who decided that a wrench could be a weapon and a song a battle cry. They had no tanks, no planes, no armies of their own, only courage, cunning, and machetes. And yet with these simple tools, they helped move the world. They proved that the most powerful force in history is not the might of an empire, but the unwavering will of the people it tries to subdue. So the next time you hear a train cutting through the African dawn, its whistle a long, low call across the plains, listen closely. The rhythm of its wheels, clack, 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 clack. That is not just the sound of metal on metal. It is the rhythm of their heartbeat, steady, relentless, free. This has been Hidden Frontlines, where the echoes of an unseen war still speak and the timeless lessons of courage still guide us forward. Subscribe, remember, and never ever forget the hands that built the roads to freedom.